As I approach a new project, my process always begins with this question. What is it about? Here's one answer that might apply to a Star Trek movie. I want it to be about the most horrible, treacherous aliens ever known to man who are about to destroy life as we know it, leading to the most spectacular thrill ride of an adventure with fantastic space battles and huge explosions and great special effects, a white-knuckle ride for the movie audience. Yeah, but what's it about? I can write space battles with the best of them, but what makes that space battle interesting to me is why are they fighting? What are the stakes? What does a hero lose if he loses? And what does he win if he wins? Why should we care? I'm talking about the second level of storytelling. The level that examines what's going on inside the characters. The moral and ethical dilemmas, their doubts, fears, inner conflicts, how they change as the story progresses. These are things that make us, as members of an audience, get emotionally involved. Hello, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's video on Micheal Piller, the savior of Star Trek. This was a Patreon requested video requested by patron Greg Marley. Thank you so much for your request. In this video, I will examine the Star Trek career of Micheal Piller and the impact that he had on the Star Trek franchise from my perspective, giving my personal opinions on what kind of effects that he had and what kind of writer he was and how I think he benefited the show and where I think he may have faltered. And of course, I wasn't there in the writer's room, so I'm basing this off of many secondhand accounts through interviews and what people worked on the show has said, and interviews with Micheal Piller himself, who sadly is no longer with us, but going by some of his past interviews, and also from what I can see of the episodes that he worked on and the shows that he worked on and what he helped craft. So I did talk about this a bit in some of my other videos already, but Micheal Piller came on board in the third season of Next Generation. The first two seasons were riddled with chaos. The showrunner Maurice Hurley was in a constant battle with his own writers. There was a ridiculous amount of turnover in staff in the first and second seasons, particularly the first season. And in the second season, there was a group of writers led by Tracy Torme who were said to be in a civil war with Maurice Hurley. And so a lot of this is detailed in a documentary called Chaos on the Bridge, which is an apt title because that's how the writer's room was described, mostly as chaotic. And some of this could be attributed to Gene Roddenberry himself, who still during those first two seasons had a tight handle, close control over the show, and was seen to be very restrictive and would do a lot of, I would say there was accusations that he, through his lawyer, did a lot of unethical rewrites. And people, were in constant battle of trying to get ideas past him because he had the Roddenberry box that was very restrictive on what you could do with the characters in the 24th century setting, which he had envisioned as a sort of enlightened utopia, so that there was no personal conflict, which made it hard for the writers to write episodes because conflict is usually at the heart of storytelling. So, at the end of season 2, Maurice Hurley I think very wisely, was fired because, my personal opinion, he was not a good showrunner, which is why season 2 in particular was not very good. A lot of his writing comes off to me as sitcom-ish and 80s-ish, and the cheese element, I think, that were in the first 2 seasons had a lot to do with him. Not entirely, because he wasn't that involved in the first batch of episodes of season 1, which were arguably even more cheesy. But anyway, whatever the element was, Maurice Hurley was was fired from the show. And so with that, in season 3, they hired a new showrunner, Michael Wagner, who only lasted for 4 episodes, I believe, before quitting. I think none of those episodes were even completed by the time that he quit. He was credited as writing, I believe, 2 out of the 4 first episodes of season 3. However, some of those episodes Micheal Piller does have a writing credit on, because he had to go and do a polish of the script or rewrite it. So Michael Wagner quit because he couldn't deal with Gene Roddenberry. He felt that it is said that he was in tears at one point because Roddenberry rejected every single one of his ideas, and he felt stifled and that he couldn't do anything and he couldn't work under those conditions. So they were in a pickle. Season 3 was going forward, and they just lost their showrunner, so they didn't have a showrunner. So they hired one of Michael Wagner's friends, someone who worked with him in the past on other shows, Micheal Piller. And Micheal Piller did not know anything about science fiction or Star Trek, but was known as a character writer. So Micheal Piller came on board during season 3. Now, season 3 was already shaping up to a lot of things were improving behind the scenes as far as like production value of the show. They got new uniforms. The cinematography was much better. They hired a cinematographer, Marvin Rush, who lit the show way better. The quality of the film seemed incredibly better. The actors were happier. They brought back Gates McFadden, got rid of Diana Muldaur, who wasn't really happy on the show and whose character did not work, in my humble opinion. So a lot of things were already improving on season 3, so I can't credit everything to Micheal Piller. But I will say the quality of writing in season 3 was definitely due to his style, his leadership. Now, there's several things that are said about Micheal Piller and his style. The first and foremost thing, and why I personally think he is the savior of Star Trek, is that he, first and foremost, values character stories above all else. Even though it's a sci-fi setting, and you have weird sci-fi stuff happening, and adventures, and aliens attacking, and explosions, and all sorts of other things, like that quote I read at the start of the video, his main focus is, even through the action, even through the weird sci-fi stuff, is characters. And that is something Ronald D. Moore, another writer who Piller hired during season 3 of Next Generation, something that Ronald D. Moore said about Micheal Piller is that the way he approached each episode, writing each episode, was who was it about and what were we saying about this character. Every episode had to be a Geordi episode, or a Picard episode, or a Riker episode, or a Beverly episode. Every episode had to have a focus on the characters. What were we saying about these characters? What was their character journey? And I think that's the best kind of writing, personally. I think that is what made Star Trek good. And I've heard opinions that I disagree with, that Next Generation didn't really have fleshed out characters, or that they didn't come off as, they were kind of flat and didn't come off as having interpersonal relations, which I think may apply to season 1 and 2, but definitely not the rest of the show. I think Micheal Piller brought that sense of characters. Now, I think Micheal Piller, the question of whether or not he's the savior of Star Trek, he himself had denied this when people called him that. He was like, look, I was just a producer who did the best I can to try to make this show good. I didn't save anything. But Ira Steven Behr, who worked very closely with him in season 3 of TNG, and then again in the first 2 seasons of Deep Space Nine, disagrees. He does call Micheal Piller the savior of Star Trek. And I think he's correct. Because at the time he came on the show, Star Trek was a dying franchise. Star Trek V had just come out and bombed, and everyone agreed that was not a good movie. Next Generation had only had 2 seasons, both to this day are received very poorly and seemed to be the bane of the show. However, at the time, that's all the show was. And so it was the dying franchise. Because Star Trek V bombed and the Next Generation was met, when it first came out, it was not seen as this next iteration of Star Trek that was a savior. It was not held in such revelry as it is today. It was received just as poorly, if not more poorly, than Star Trek Discovery was received when it first came out. There were protests, letter writing campaigns, all complaining, how dare you make a Star Trek show without Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. There is no Star Trek without Scotty or Spock or Kirk. And people were still skeptical throughout the first 2 seasons run. And rightfully so, because barring a few exceptional episodes, such as Measure of a Man, the seasons were not good. And as I said, there were already other improvements being made even before Micheal Piller joined, but Micheal Piller definitely is what changed the most important aspect of a TV show, and that's not the cinematography, it's not the special effects, it's not the wardrobe, and it's not even the acting. It's the writing. That's what's the heart of everything, and I've talked about this a lot, is that a lot of times you don't get good acting if you don't have good writing. Sometimes there will be really great actors who can make good writing look good, or bad writing look good, but even the greatest of actors can only do so much with terrible writing. If the writing is good, the acting will be good. And if you have great cinematography, great visual effects, great wardrobe, none of that really matters if the writing is not there. Game of Thrones Season 8 is a great example of that, which had some of the most beautiful production values I've ever seen on any show, but because the writing was crap, that means the show is crap. And so everything begins and ends with the writing, in my opinion. So that's what Micheal Piller brought. The sense of focusing on the character stories and putting the characters first and foremost is what made Star Trek good. And the fact that Next Generation for the next 5 years just improved more and more under his leadership is what saved Star Trek. Star Trek would have died if Maurice Hurley stayed there and Gene Roddenberry ran it to the ground and continued to do what they were doing in the first 2 seasons. Even if they got better uniforms, even if they got a better cinematographer, if the writing remained the same, then the show would have never become the classic that it had. It would have died. It wouldn't have lasted 7 seasons. There would have been no more Star Trek movies. The only reason Star Trek 6 was even made was because of the success of Star Trek Next Generation after Micheal Piller came on board. So without Micheal Piller, I would argue there would be no Star Trek 6. There would be no more Star Trek movies. Star Trek Next Generation wouldn't last 7 seasons, and there most definitely would not be any more Star Trek spin-offs. Star Trek as a franchise would be dead. So, yes, he is the savior of Star Trek. Whatever you think of him, and I know a lot of people have mixed opinions on writing, and not everything he wrote was genius. We'll get into some of that. But his mentality of how to write and what needed to be done for good writing is what saved the show. Now, does that mean that all the writers got along with him and that once he came on board, the writing room was no longer in chaos and was a blissful place full of happy workers? Absolutely not. The writers of season 3, many of them were hangovers from season 2, such as Melinda Snodgrass, Richard Manning, Hans Bimler, and I believe there was a few others. Someone who quit like halfway through season 3. Yeah, they were all on were hang-ups over from season 2, and none of them liked Micheal Piller. They found him hard to work with. They found him constricting. And from all accounts, Micheal Piller was not good with dealing with people. He might have been a great writer, and I think he inspired great writing, but he did... There was a line in an episode from season 3, Hollow Pursuits, about Reginald Barclay, where Barclay says, "I'm the one who at parties stands in the corner trying to look comfortable examining a potted plant." Apparently that line came directly from Piller and how he describes himself. So he's not what one would call a extrovert and wasn't particularly good with dealing with people. In fact, it is said that his function as a writer was to remain in his office and not really be hands-on or in the writer's room with the other writers. But at least at first, because I know that in later seasons he was in the writer's room a lot. So he shortly then hired Ira Steven Behr, who was kind of his second in command, who worked more closely with the writers and was more personable with the writers, and that would report directly to Micheal Piller and would try to implement and get the writers to do something, follow Piller's guidelines. And so he was around in season 3. And season 3 to this day is my favorite season of Next Generation. Actually, it's my favorite season of any of Star Trek show. Because I think, not because there were a lot of amazing episodes. I think there were only like 3 or 4 amazing episodes. But because there were no bad episodes, in my opinion, is that every episode sort of was good to a certain degree. Every episode had something to say. Every episode was about characters. Every episode explored characters. Yes, even Menage a Troy. And so I think he did a brilliant job. And it's interesting to note that there was still chaos. As I talked about, there was specific events that I detailed in another video I did about the writing in season 3, about a memo that Micheal Piller wrote that pissed off all the writers and had them up in arms, calling their agents and throwing furniture around the room, and how there would be constant fights with Micheal Piller shooting down ideas or stories that the writers really wanted to do. And to be honest, though, as particularly after listening to specific examples of ideas he shot down, I agree with him. I think he understood Star Trek and was, even though ironically didn't know anything about it before coming on board. He took on the guidelines. And this is what I love what he said about the Roddenberry box. Because I talked about it. Maurice Hurley in particularly constantly butted heads with the Roddenberry box and spoke out against it and said he hated it. And a lot of the other writers in season 1 and 2 talked about how restrictive it was and how unrealistic it was and how it just was killing the show. But it's interesting, Micheal Piller's the way he viewed the Roddenberry box is he said he saw it as a challenge. It challenged them to work harder, to instead of just relying on some of the old tropes of that television writers are used to and use as crutches, such as conflicts and interpersonal conflicts or whatever, that it challenged them to work around it. And I actually think that's a really good way to look at it. And I think that's why he excelled at the job. Now, it should be said that all of the writers in season 3, save for Ronald D. Moore, who was very young, a rookie that was hired from the open submissions process during season 3. All of the writers in season 3 quit, mostly because they couldn't deal with Micheal Piller and they didn't like working with him. Ira Steven Behr did enjoy working with Micheal Piller, but he said he just was not happy in Star Trek and just didn't want to go through it anymore. In fact, Micheal Piller himself was considering quitting at the end of season 3. They even wrote it into the season 3 finale, Best of Both Worlds, where Riker had a plot storyline about whether or not he should leave the Enterprise, which was supposed to mirror Micheal Piller's own conflictions on whether or not he should leave Star Trek. And just as Riker decided to stay on the Enterprise, Piller decided to stay with Star Trek. So, then there was season 4, which I personally don't like as much as season 3, but Micheal Piller does prefer it. Maybe it has to do with his own personal experience, because it is said from season 4 onward is when everything clicked, is when they no longer had that chaos in the writing room. He hired Jeri Taylor to take Ira Steven Behr's place as his second in command, who is very good with dealing with the writing staff. And a lot of the younger writers refer to her as a mother type figure in the writers' room. And they hired other staples of the writers of the show who would stay there for quite some time, like Brennan Braga and Joe Manowski. I think Naren Shankar was a scientific advisor at the time. He would eventually become a writer. And apparently they had, a much easier time. And Roddenberry himself was barely involved with the show now because his health was declining. And so they no longer had that sort of had to deal with that final say who would shoot stuff down and ask for weird sex things to be put into the episodes. They no longer had to deal with that. And yeah, I would say that season 4 wasn't quite as good as season 3, but I still loved it. There was still a lot of great episodes. They still had a lot, tried to focus on characters first and foremost. And from then on, Star Trek just improved and kept getting better. And you could see the influence of Piller and his style. Now, one thing that should be noted of Piller is that just because you don't see his name in the writing credits, if it doesn't say written by or story by or teleplay by, does not mean that he wasn't involved. He was involved as a showrunner. He was involved in pretty much every episode. It's the way that union rules work, that only so many writers can be credited for an episode. And so he himself said that he had rewritten several episodes, but never puts his name on it because that's not seen as kosher. He doesn't want to take the credit away from the writer who wrote the episodes. So many of these episodes he practically wrote most of it, but is uncredited on it because he didn't want to steal credit away from the original writer, something that Roddenberry and Maurice Hurley would do. So I think that's very much to his credit, but it's also to keep in mind that, because I remember talking about the series finale, All Good Things, and how Micheal Piller came up with the idea for it, and someone saying that, well, it's not written by him, it's written by Brennan Braga and Ronald D. Moore. It's right there in the credits. But it's like, you got to keep in mind that just because his name's not on the writing credits doesn't mean he's not the one who came up with the idea and had the guidelines for it. They usually have use the writing room process, and it would have a team of writers in the room. So usually they would work collectively, but Micheal Piller had the final say on everything as showrunner. Of course, Jeri Taylor also helped influence it a lot as sort of the second in command and the one who worked more directly with the writers. But yeah, from a lot of accounts, from a lot of different writers like Brendan Braga, Naren Shankar, Behr, and many of the writers that worked with Piller throughout the years, said that he was not an easy man to get along with, but ultimately said that he helped them become better writers. And many of the writers that he did work with during his time Next Generation went on to become showrunners themselves. Ronald D. Moore, Brendan Braga, Renee Echevarria, Naren Shankar, Richard Biller, and yeah, probably even more. So he did have, and of course Jeri Taylor became a showrunner with him over on Voyager. So yes, he definitely did have a very positive influence through Trek. And you could tell season 5 in particular became more focused on characters and drama, really. So he did bring something special to Star Trek. So he also helped create Deep Space Nine, and one of his first decisions when he was creating Deep Space Nine was to bring Ira Steven Behr on board. Now, Ira Steven Behr had kind of sworn off of Star Trek because of his bad experience during season 3, but Micheal Piller apparently appreciated him and knew that he had a lot of talent and knew that he was good with people, and so really went hard out to pitch him to coming on board as a writer on Deep Space Nine, with the understanding that he would take over as showrunner in a couple of years. And so Piller was able to talk him into that. Now Piller thought that him and Rick Berman came up with the idea to make another Star Trek spinoff because they thought that Next Generation being as successful as it was, the natural next step is to have a spinoff, which I'm not sure I understand the reasoning. It doesn't seem like every show would have a spinoff, but that was their understanding. And so they created Deep Space Nine, and much like they'll do with Voyager later on, they baked a situation into the premise of the show that would allow for interpersonal conflicts. So they kind of circumvented the Roddenberry box rather than just having a pure crew of Starfleet officers. They would intermix them with another group. Therefore, since there wasn't all the perfect, humanity of the 24th century, you had aliens or different type of people outside of the Federation intermixing with the Starfleet characters. Then that would allow for personal conflict. Although I would say in both shows, though, this only lasted for a season or two, and then they got used to each other so well that it was kind of defeated. The premise became mute. It became unnecessary. It wasn't even there anymore. But from time to time, they would still use it for conflict. And so after only one season of Deep Space Nine, which Micheal Piller was the showrunner for, he was still technically the showrunner for Next Generation in season 6 because but he was working between two shows, so most of his attention was focused on Deep Space Nine. And he gave showrunner duties over to Jeri Taylor for the most part, but he still was involved in TNG and still oversaw it. The showrunner in name, like he still approved all the scripts, but he was still more focused on. So he was less there. So he was more reliant on Jeri Taylor to run the day-to-day of TNG. And then apparently in between Deep Space Nine Season 1 and 2, which is also in between Next Generation Season 6 and 7, is when Jeri Taylor, Rick Berman, and Micheal Piller started having private meetings that no one even knew about and no one was aware of the contents of. But what they were doing was creating another spin-off Star Trek show, which of course would eventually be called Voyager. This was prompted by Paramount wanting to create a network, their own network, something they've been wanting to do since 1978, but with the success of the Fox network, that inspired them even more to finally create the network, and their idea was to have a new Star Trek show in order to launch this network. And so Piller and Berman kind of agreed that they were successful in running two Star Trek shows side by side, and they knew that Next Generation would be coming to an end after season 7, so they wanted to create another Star Trek show to take its place so they could continue to have two Star Trek shows running side by side. So this, by all accounts, was a very hectic time in the franchise because they were writing for Star Trek Deep Space Nine Season 2, Star Trek Next Generation Season 7. They were working on the Star Trek movie, the first movie to feature the Next Generation cast, Generations. And they were creating Voyager all at the same time. So, yeah, it was a very hectic time. So Micheal Piller pretty much turned showrunner duties over to Jeri Taylor entirely for Next Generation Season 7 and focus more on, because he already had to focus on Deep Space Nine and creating Voyager. Jeri Taylor had to focus on creating Voyager and running Next Gen Season 7. So he couldn't really be that much involved with Season 7 of TNG, although he was, as I said, somewhat involved. He didn't completely leave it, but Jeri Taylor did essentially become the showrunner during that time. And Micheal Piller also depended a lot on Ira Steven Behr to help him with, more than before, to help him with DS9 Season 2. And so they went on, Voyager was launched, and he went on to become the showrunner along with Jeri Taylor, kind of co-showrunners for Voyager. So when he left Deep Space Nine in Season 3, the parting advice that he gave Ira Steven Behr was, because they were writing the episode Life Support around the time he was leaving, the episode in which they killed off the reoccurring character of Vedic Bareil, and Micheal Piller's parting terms was, please do not do this. You can do what you want and what you see fit. You're the showrunner now, but my suggestion, my advice, would be not to kill off this character. He's too important to the show. And Ira Steven Behr is like, I value your opinion, and I will take it under advisement. And then they promptly killed him off. Which, to be fair, see, this is what I was thinking of Micheal Piller. Like, he's definitely, there's a lot of decisions that he made. And a lot of, even, as I said, not just the episodes he wrote, but ones I heard he rewrote. Or, like, The Offspring. Or some of the notes I've heard him give on specific episodes. Like, what if we do this way? Usually it's like I can see that he definitely improves a lot of these storylines, and had he not been there, a lot of these episodes would not have been as good as they were. A really prime example of this would be the 5th season episode, The Inner Light, seen as one of the best episodes of the show. He doesn't have a writing credit on that. The writing credit goes to Morgan Gindle and Peter Allen Fields. But from Morgan Gindle's own accounts, he worked very closely with Piller, and that Gindle's original idea for The Inner Light was incredibly different, but Piller helped him find the heart and the soul by focusing on characters and help him guide him to make it the episode what it was. So, all in all, I think as a writer, Piller is probably the best thing that ever happened to Star Trek, and I agree with him way more than I don't. That being said, he wasn't always right. For example, his suggestion to not kill off Vedic Baral. I agree more with Ira Stephen Behr, and I think Piller was right to say, well, it's up to you, because the show was now his. Ira Stephen Behr's show for all intents and purposes. And so he should do what he feels is right for it. And I think, and for what the direction he wants to go to and the direction he wanted to take the show, I don't think Vedic Baral was really relevant or would have fit in to it. But anyway, so Piller went off to do Voyager, and I think created or helped create season 1 and 2 of Voyager, which, in my opinion, 2 of the best seasons of Voyager, along with season 4. I think season 3 was a unmitigated disaster, and then seasons 5, 6, and 7 were just bland, and they were just getting more bland until it ended in season 7 very bland. And then Micheal Piller was not involved at all in Enterprise. So, the one major difference, I would say, for particularly Voyager season 5 through 7 and Enterprise, or at least the first 2 seasons in particular, but the Enterprise is another story that had a different savior called Manny Koto, but that's another tale for another time. But the main difference between those is that it wasn't focused on the characters. It didn't have Micheal Piller there to have dynamic, fleshed out, and interesting characters. The characters on Voyager in the final 3 seasons turned bland, less interesting. They were all underutilized. By the time we get to season 7, it became the Doctor and 7 of 9 show. And even though at that point 7 of 9 was not nearly as interesting as a character as she was in season 4, with granted that had nothing to do with Piller because it was already gone by season 4, but still, it showed how the characters became bland and went downhill. Of course, who was involved in season 4 was Jeri Taylor, and she left the show in season 4, so it's the last remnant of the Piller team. And that's really when the characters started being bland. You no longer had that focus on characters. And of course, Enterprise was created with bland, uninteresting characters and flat characters. And as I said, that Manny Koto saved it in the last 2 seasons, but he's his own savior. But yeah, a lot of people say they don't like the 2nd season of Voyager, and I very strongly disagree with them. Yes, there are some bad episodes. There's the episodes where Neelix and Tom Paris are having a feud over Cass are not very good. The infamous Threshold episode. Although I think there are worse examples. I think that episode is maybe not as bad as everyone else claims it to be, but it's still bad. I certainly don't think it tanks the entire season of season 2. I think seasons 1 and 2 had that focus on characters. It presented the show as a family, as a community, and you had that sense of community, and you had character growth with the characters. And I could see that this was Micheal Piller's, and Jeri Taylor's, to be fair, but mostly Micheal Piller's, in my humble opinion. And the reason why I have this opinion I'll get to shortly. But it was mostly their influence. It was Micheal Piller's focus in that he was involved in creating these characters, and that's why they popped. That's why they had such a focus on characters, such a sense of community, such a sense of interpersonal relationships that were fascinating, interesting, and really felt fleshed out and like real people. And getting back to Deep Space Nine a little bit, even though Piller left the show in season 3, Deep Space Nine went on to become my favorite Star Trek show. Even though Piller was not there anymore, he's the one who created the situation, the characters, and put that love and care into creating these great characters, and hired Ira Steven Behr, someone who he'd worked with in the past, who he knew would have the same mentality and would be capable of bringing these characters to life and making a really new, different take on Star Trek. So he had the wisdom to put someone in charge like that, and that's why it became an amazing show. Now, I have my issues with Ira Steven Behr, some of the stuff he did in later seasons, but again, that's a tale for another time. Focus more on Micheal Piller. So getting back to Voyager, one of the things that people complain the most about in Voyager is that it wasn't serialized enough, and the studio in particular, and Rick Berman, fought back against any sort of serialization of the show, and I think that was to its detriment, because the premise of the show kind of demanded it, and that was kind of their fault. If they didn't want serialization, they shouldn't have created a premise where they were out alone on the other side of the galaxy, where they couldn't restock, where they couldn't go to a star base to get their ship repaired or get more shuttlecrafts, where they couldn't restock with more Starfleet officers, where they had to contend with the same group of people the whole time, and where what they would do would have consequences that wouldn't simply go away had it still been in, near Starfleet. And so they created a premise that demand some serialization, and yet they fought against it, which was to the show's detriment. And this is relevant as far as Micheal Piller is concerned, is because he was pushed out of the show at the end of season 2, which I'll get to more shortly. And one of the main reasons why, is because he was trying to make the show more serialized. Now, it was serialized in the sense of the characters. As I said, in the first 2 seasons of Voyager, we had character growth. We had continuing character arcs. And there was some sense of continuity through the characters. It was kind of, I would akin it to something like Strange New Worlds, where every episode is episodic, but you have ongoing storylines with the characters. Now, it wasn't to that degree, to be fair, but you definitely had, like, the Doctor, you could definitely follow his growth. Cass, you could definitely follow her growth, where she was learning, she was growing, learning to be more of a, her interpersonal skills were improving, and the Doctor, of course, learning to see himself as an individual, learning to becoming sentient. You saw that process, and you saw character growth with pretty much every character. Tom Paris learning to become more part of the crew, the Maquis crew members like Chakotay and B'Elanna Torres working more with the Starfleet officers and growing with them. Tuvok learning from his own mistakes, like not trusting Janeway, and of course Janeway's huge character growth on dealing with the situation, trying to get her crew home when being trapped on the other side of the galaxy. You had all these character stories, character growth in the first 2 seasons, which they showed definitely lost in the last 3 seasons. And that's what Micheal Piller brings to it. Now, particularly as far as the serialization goes, something I mentioned, the chaotic butting of heads in the first 2 seasons of Next Generation in the writer's room. And more importantly, when Micheal Piller was there in season 3, a lot of the writers didn't like working with him because they thought he was too restrictive. That apparently was the case in season 2 of Voyager, where I think Kenneth Biller, I have some quotes from him specifically complaining about Micheal Piller being too restrictive. And one of the things that they complained about in particular was his push for serialization. Now, Jeri Taylor is quoted as saying that the Kazon was all Micheal Piller's thing, and that she didn't think the Kazon were particularly interesting. And I do agree, and most people agree, that the Kazon were not particularly good villains. And as I said, Micheal Piller's not perfect. But what I do agree with Piller on is that Seska was a very interesting villain. She was definitely by far easily the best villain the show Voyager ever had. Don't even get me started on the Borg Queen. That's that's the time. Again, that's a discussion for another time. But yes, so Piller did have some good instincts in wanting to do recurring storyline with the Kazon. And some things like the episode Alliances, where Voyager was forced to make an alliance with the Kazon sect, was a good idea. The problem with that idea and why it didn't work is because they didn't do it serialized. Because they never followed up on it. They presented this really interesting idea of them having to form an alliance with the Kazon sect for a short amount of time, just until they left their space. And that would have been a very interesting story arc that they could have done, but they abandoned it at the end of the episode and just came up with an excuse to return to the status quo, which would be a detriment that, of course, would be exasperated in later seasons, where the Voyager always had to slam the reset button hard, which was usually to the detriment of good storytelling. And you can complain about, I've heard some people complain about the first 2 seasons of doing this as well, but it wasn't due to Micheal Piller. He was fighting against this. He was trying to create a sense of continuity in some serialized arcs, such as introducing Chakotay having a son that Seska sort of used his DNA to give birth to, sort of against his will, and he's struggling with that, and that was obviously meant to be a long-term story arc. And there was the story arc of the spy who was spying for Seska and the Kazon, which I think most people don't look at too fondly, because it didn't go anywhere, and the way it was resolved in a show about Neelix having a good morning show was kind of dumb. But I appreciate the idea. I appreciate that sense of continuity. And that's what Kenneth Biller was complaining about specifically, saying that he wrote a really good, sweet episode, Life Signs, which I love that episode, but saying that it will never stand on its own because there's these scenes with some spy talking to the Kazon that has nothing to do with anything. And my reaction to that is that doesn't ruin the episode at all. That doesn't mean the episode doesn't stand on its own. You can still watch that episode and it'd be fine. There'd just be random scenes, but it connects it to the greater story of the show. It's how all modern shows work now. So I think he's coming off as a little brat, personally. But here's the bigger point, because I mentioned that Micheal Piller was pushed out of the writer's room, or pushed out of Voyager, at the end of season 2, and that was the reason the writers gave, is that they didn't like the serialized storytelling. They said that he was killing the show with this serialized storytelling, and that he was being too restrictive, he wasn't listening to their ideas, and they felt too constrained. Back to what I was saying about constraints are actually a challenge, rather than being a good writer like Piller and saying it's a challenge I need to work with. They were being bad writers like Maurice Hurley and being like, oh, they're stifling me. So the writers went, and I'm not sure which ones. I just heard the writers in general. I'm not sure if Jeri Taylor was involved in this or not. But the writers went to Rick Berman at the end of season 2 and said either he goes or we go. Now, this is a controversial statement maybe that I'm about to make. Might seem a bit of a a bit of a charged statement, but if I were Rick Berman at the time and I was the producer and the writers came to me and said either he goes or we go, I would have looked at them, I would have said to them, there's the door, don't let it hit you on the ass on the way out. And I think that's what Rick Berman should have done. Now, Micheal Piller, to his credit, from what I understand, decided to leave after hearing about this. I don't think he was officially fired, but I would think it's fair to say that he was pushed out. Because he thought, well, if they really feel that way and we can't work anymore, then perhaps I should go. And he remembered his time in season 3 of TNG where everyone quit. And I was like, well, maybe that wouldn't be beneficial. But the thing is, and I think I can tell this through how season 3, which as I mentioned I think is the worst season of the show, turned out, that was a huge mistake. And also how bland the later seasons would become also proves that it was a huge mistake. That it was the worst thing that Rick Berman could have possibly done for Voyager. And it's the worst thing that happened to Voyager was getting rid of Micheal Piller. And that undoubtedly is why the show went downhill. Now, Jeri Taylor took over, and she is a good showrunner, as she proved in season 4. But the problem with season 3 is that the shakeup with Piller leaving happened at a very late stage. So late, in fact, is when they were filming the premiere episode of season 3, Basics Part 2, which was a carryover from the finale, Basics Part 1, that Piller wrote. The actress who played Seska was told that her character was being killed off in the middle of filming. That's how late things were happening. And so they made up the whole storyline that Piller was setting up with Chakotay's son. They retconned that, wiped it clean, with the doctor saying, oh, that's not Chakotay's son. You just made it think that you were. It's actually Mashkola's son. And then Seska dies. Mashkola runs off with the baby that's not Chakotay's, never to be seen again. So they were doing everything they could to wrap this all up. Now, I'm not saying they should have kept the Kazon around. The Kazon were not interesting. And Voyager is going forward, and this is something Rick Berman even said, is like it doesn't make sense to keep his aliens around for so long if Voyager's supposed to be moving out of their space. But they could have kept Seska. They definitely could have kept Chakotay's son. My idea for this is that they would have, if they could have had Seska be captive on the ship and have her prisoner, and then her slowly starting to work as the crew as a kind of antagonistic force that they couldn't trust, but who would constantly be there. I think that would have really improved the show. And also having Chakotay have a son and having to deal with the son and being a single father, and then having the mother being in the brig and this, adversary type figure. Like, that would really shake up the show in a very good way, but that would be serialization, and that's not what the writers wanted. They wanted to run away from serialization. So what we got in season 3 was a collection of standalone, bland, poorly written episodes with no strong character stories. Rick Berman even said that with Piller gone, the writers were free to focus more on a fun space adventure show. Make it be more like the original series in TNG, be like more like a fun adventure show and not focus too much on characters. And there was also a quote from Micheal Piller about season 2 of Voyager saying that what he was doing with focusing on these serialized storytelling, with the storylines about the Kazon and the storyline about Chakotay's son and stuff like that, was to shake the show up, to separate it from Next Generation, make it not just be a carbon copy of Next Generation. It needed to be its own thing. Take advantage of the premise that you set it up with them being trapped in the Delta Quadrant. But no, that was rejected. He was pushed out of the show, and instead Voyager started to become more and more like a carbon copy of Next Generation, to the point where we got to the final 3 seasons. The ship might as well have been in the Alpha Quadrant, because they completely ignored the premise, and they would just go on one-off adventures that the exact same kind you could see in Next Generation. They never dealt with any consequences of the being far away from the Federation, with no chance of resupply and no chance of getting more officers. This was never ever addressed ever again. And so they might as well have been taking place in the Alpha Quadrant. Now, to Jeri Taylor's credit, I think a lot of the mishaps of season 3 just had to do with the fact that this shakeup happened at the last minute. And so the first half of season 3, or maybe 3/4 of season 3, was not good, with a couple of few exceptions. One of the exceptions was the episode Remember, and the reason why that was such a success and such a powerful episode is because it was an already written script that was written for TNG that was never filmed and was just adapted for Voyager characters, so it was already written. All the new scripts that they were writing, it was clear that they lost their direction. They weren't sure what to do with the characters. They were trying to take the show in a new direction, and it just wasn't working. I think it was just might have been happy, might have been a more sort of satisfied writer's room without Micheal Piller there, but without Micheal Piller there to keep them in check, to keep their bad ideas in line, it kind of fell apart and became chaotic, and it definitely lessened the quality of the show. Now, I think they did get their shit together towards the end of season 3. We did get some good episodes, decent episodes. It did sort of shape up a little bit better towards the end of the season. It ended with the best season finale that the show would ever see. So there's that. One of the best episodes of the show, where they decided to bring the Borg back. And then that led into season 4, which, as I said, was actually the best season of the show, to Jeri Taylor's credit. Micheal Piller wasn't there. I think she just needed time to readjust to not having Piller there. She even said herself in a quote that it was really difficult at first to not have Micheal Piller around because she was so used to working with him. So I think it just took her some time to adjust to it. And I think, season 4, they really got in their groove. They did a great job of introducing the character of 7 of 9. But then after season 4, Jeri Taylor left the show and Brennan Braga took over. Now, Brennan Braga is a good writer. He's written some of my favorite episodes of Star Trek. A Year of Hell in season 4 Voyager, Timescape, Frame of Mind, a lot of good stuff. But he's not a good showrunner, and I think that was proven. And so he was the showrunner for season 5 of Voyager, which it was obvious they had no idea who the hell the characters were and tried to reinvent all of the characters and give them traits that they never had before. They made Janeway lock herself in the room and be depressed over leaving the ship in the Delta Quadrant, which happened 4 years ago, yet she never acted like this before. They gave Chakotay a love of boxing that came out of nowhere. They made Harry Kim into a swiny little brat who just wanted to go off and have affairs, which was against his character. They made B'Elanna Torres suicidal, which came out of nowhere. So, they kind of didn't know what the fuck they were doing and were just trying to reinvent the characters. And then in season 6, it was more of a hit or miss season. There were still some good aspects. You still had good writers. Brennan Braga is still a good writer, to be fair. And you had Ronald D. Moore tried to come into the show after the ending of season of Deep Space Nine, but just couldn't deal with Brennan Braga as a showrunner. They were a writing team. They wrote so many episodes together in Next Generation, and he said that nearly his experience in trying to come to Voyager nearly destroyed their friendship. And because Ronald D. Moore had a lot of ideas about serialization and how to shake up the show, and Brennan Braga and Rick Berman were not hearing it, and he got so frustrated he quit after 2 episodes. After writing one of the best episodes of the show, by the way, Survival Instinct, but then promptly quitting because he couldn't deal with it. And then in season 7, Brennan Braga left as showrunner to start creating Enterprise, and Kenneth Biller took over as showrunner. Kenneth Biller was one of the chief people who were complaining about Micheal Piller. He did an even worse job than Brennan Braga. Season 7 is when they really started to go downhill. And I think Rick Berman and the brass just didn't care about Voyager at this stage and were too focused on doing Enterprise. And yes, so Enterprise, as I said, was a different story. Brennan Braga and Rick Berman had no business being showrunners. They created a show. They had no talent in creating a show, and so they created a very bland, boring premise with bland and boring characters, and they were trying too hard to appeal to audiences, and they obviously were not creative and didn't know how to create Star Trek. But thankfully, Manny Coto, someone who did understand Star Trek, came in during season 3, took over, not officially showrunner, but took over pretty much as showrunner towards the end of season 3, then officially became the showrunner in season 4, thanks to the new studio, CBS, that took over, who didn't like Rick Berman, and so kicked Rick Berman and Brennan Braga off the show, which is the smartest thing they could have done, and made Manny Coto the showrunner in season 4, which by all accounts, season 4 fan favorite season, although I do prefer season 3, but both of them were mostly due to Manny Coto and his focus on the characters and making it more about the characters. But anyway, that's all stuff that happened after Micheal Piller left. But this wasn't the end of Micheal Piller's involvement. To be fair, I do believe that Micheal Piller stayed on as a producer on Voyager. Not a writer anymore though. Wasn't involved in the creative side at all. Simply the money side. He went off to do his own show, Legend, with the guy who played MacGyver. What's his name? He went on to do Stargate SG-1. Richard Dean Anderson. And that's a Western, so I tried watching it. Oh, I think Q was the co-star too. Jonathan, what's his name? Q. Anyway, is it Jonathan? No, it's not. Oh, I can't remember what his name is. You know, I don't know why his name is escaping me, but Q. He was the co-star, and I tried watching that show, and I thought it sucked. But to be fair, I don't like Westerns. So that's just me. I know Micheal Piller was a huge fan of Westerns, but it didn't last very long. But anyway, he stayed involved with Star Trek, and in fact was asked to write the third Next Generation movie, Insurrection, which I do believe was his last writing credit for Star Trek. Now, I do know a lot of people who hold this against him, who say that they point to the Insurrection to point to why Micheal Piller is not that great of a writer, and how he wrote some bad things. And I think that's totally unfair. Because here's the thing. For Insurrection, which was a very bland movie, it wasn't absolutely terrible. People who say that Star Trek V is better than it are outright wrong. It's nowhere near as bad as Star Trek V, but it's not that good of a movie. It's kind of just like an episode of TNG. But to say one of my signature lines, which apparently I say a lot, I blame Rick Berman for Insurrection, not Micheal Piller. And here's why. I heard about Micheal Piller's original idea for the third Star Trek movie, and it sounds fucking spectacular. I'm doing this from memory, so I might not be completely accurate, but I believe his idea was based on the novel Heart of Darkness, which was turned into the movie Apocalypse Now. And it would be about Picard's old friend, Gordon Sweller, who was seen in the episode Tapestry, his old Starfleet Academy friend, would go off and disappear and go rogue, and apparently take over steal this planet from the Romulans or whatever. And so Captain Picard is paired up with a Romulan to try to, stop his old friend from doing the crazy shit he's doing on the planet. And when they get there, he finds out that there's some sort of fountain of youth on that planet, and that the Romulans are trying to kick the people who live there off. And so Gordon Sweller was sort of on a mission to save these people. And so Picard ends up teaming up with Gordon Sweller and understanding that what they're doing is wrong, but it's the Starfleet's official position to back the Romulans in order to try to make peace with them. And I think the Romulans are offering to share this Fountain of Youth technology with them. And so Picard defies Starfleet orders to go off and help his friend, but Data is very much against that. And they end up sort of butting heads, and they end up going head to head. Because Data does do what follows Starfleet orders, and it becomes sort of a conflict storyline between them. Now, you can see how there's aspects, and again, I might not be totally accurate with that description. I might be leaving some things out, but that's generally the idea from what I can recall. And you can tell there's some aspects of that resemble the finished product of Insurrection. But man, does it sound so much better than what Insurrection was. Because Insurrection, rather than having Picard and Data go head to head and be in this conflict, it just has a dumb scene where Data's ethical chip malfunctions, and he like is acting like crazy, and Worf and Picard have to shut him down, which I thought was a bland, dumb sequence when they had to sing the song to get him to shut down. Just having him a malfunction storyline seemed too much like what they did with him in Brothers, which I also didn't like, and also makes him come off as a security risk rather than it be more of a philosophical difference where they're at opposite ends in the conflict, which would have been way better. Also, having a Heart of Darkness type storyline that brings back the character from Tapestry, but to see whatever happened to him and Picard having to reconnect with him and him win him to his side is much better than the bull Bucky that they did on the freaking actual Insurrection storyline, where he meets this random chick and they have this one-off romance that nobody gives a shit about. And also introducing these weird-looking aliens that nobody gives a shit about, instead of having the Romulans and having what sounded like a very good, from the description, a very dynamic and good villain, as opposed to this one-dimensional Raffle or whatever his name was villain that we did get. And some stereotypical asshole admiral like who is not giving a shit about these people, although that does seem like aspects of that would be similar. But regardless, the reason why Micheal Piller's original idea didn't go forward is because of Rick Berman, which is why I blame him. I don't blame Micheal Piller. He basically neutered the story. He told Micheal Piller it was too dark, and they didn't want to do another dark movie after doing First Contact. They wanted something more lighthearted to go along the lines of Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. And so that's why Insurrection is filled with a lot of dumb jokes that, granted, as I said, nowhere near as bad as the dumb jokes in Star Trek V, but still, they don't work that much. And having the lighthearted tone was definitely a detriment to the film. So studio notes, it was Rick Berman saying, "Oh, we can't have Data and Picard fight each other. Audiences won't like that." So he neutered an excellent idea. So I don't care. I think people who point to Insurrection to say, "Oh, Micheal Piller's not that good of a writer," are wrong. They're inaccurate, because that's Rick Berman not being a good writer, because Rick Berman constraining his and that happened a lot with all the 4 movies, to be fair. Like, in all 4 cases, Rick Berman put too many conditions on it, and that's what he did with Voyager too, and that's part of the reason why Voyager started to fail as well. So, as in all things, I blame Rick Berman. But again, that is another discussion. Point is, Micheal Piller was the best thing that ever happened to Star Trek, because he made it about the characters, and he was a damn good storyteller. He knew how to work within confines, challenges within confines, instead of seeing them as obstacles, saw them as a challenge. And he inspired a lot of the other writers to think the same way. A lot of other writers learned from him, grew from him, even though he wasn't very personable, even though he could be a pain in the ass to work with, as many writers account. What came first to him is not making the writers comfortable, but telling good stories. And from the judgment of how season 3, 4, 5, and 6 of TNG turned out, the first season of DS9 wasn't that good, but they were still trying their footing. But season 2 of DS9 got better, and then the first 2 seasons of Voyager, along with season 4, the best of the show, proved that he was definitely a positive. He definitely was a driving force to why Star Trek got saved, and to why the writing was so good. And when he left, the writing suffered. I mean, there was a few exceptions, such as season 4 in Voyager, where Jeri Taylor found her footing from what she learned from working with Piller, and the last 2 seasons of Enterprise were saved from Manny Koto. But in between, there was a lot of getting away from the characters, a lot of blandness, and lacking what Micheal Piller brought to the show. And so I maintain. And DS9, even though Micheal Piller wasn't involved in the later season of DS9, is someone who worked very closely with him, someone he handpicked to be the showrunner himself. Rather, he didn't pick Brennan Braga or Kenneth Biller to be the showrunners for Voyager. Handpicked Ira Steven Behr to be the showrunner, and DS9 ended up being amazing. So, it is tragic, of course, that he passed away. But if he hadn't, it would have been good to have him work on modern Star Trek. I've heard the opinion before that they should bring back Rick Berman for modern Star Trek, and I'm like, you're fucking out of your minds. I'm sorry, but Rick Berman would be worse than Alex Kurtzman. People will be like, oh, but Star Trek was so good under the Rick Berman years. No, it wasn't. It was good under Micheal Piller. It was good when Rick Berman was working with Micheal Piller. When Micheal Piller left, it had a couple of good years, but for the most part, it just wasn't the same. So, that is it for my video on Micheal Piller. This did go a lot longer than I thought it would, but I do thank you so much for watching. Thanks for Greg Marley for suggesting this. Little Patreon supporter. If you would like to support me on Patreon, be very much appreciated. I have different tiers for different budgets. Some include Patreon-only videos I do for revisited videos where I revisit reviews I've already done, or I have pre-releases, and at a high enough tier you can request a video for me to do like this one, and I will do it. Otherwise, if you can't support me on Patreon, and just by leaving a like or making a comment also really, really helps a lot. And yeah, helps me in the algorithm, and yeah, supports the channel at, a lot. And of course, subscribing very much to get notifications also really helps. So thanks so much for watching, and be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.